Thank you. Oh gosh, that was louder than I thought. And good evening, everybody. It's so wonderful and amazing to be sitting here with you tonight, Madelaine, because we've known each other for a very long time. Madelaine's a good friend of my daughter's and has babysat my children. And we've done gigs together because we're both musicians. But the first time I read Madelaine's writing was when she won the Elizabeth Joly Short Story Prize in 2018, which was actually a short story that became this novel. And I remember being so struck by how resonant and beautiful it was, and I was so thrilled when I discovered that the book had expanded upon that. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that process happened?
Yeah, so when I originally conceived of the book, I suppose I was thinking of it as a series of connected short stories. You know, I came to writing through a love of short fiction first. And this story actually began even earlier than that, when I was 24, the same age my narrator is when the central events of this novel take place. And I wrote a short story about a young woman, her older boyfriend, and their dog, and the small beach town where they lived together. And that was almost a decade ago now. So, you know, Thirst for Salt is often described as a coming-of-age story, but I also think of it as holding a record of my own coming-of-age and all the growth that I had to do as a writer and a woman to be able to tell the story that needed to be told.
One of the things about it that's so extraordinary is that although at its heart it's a very intense love affair, it's also a love story between mothers and daughters, girlfriends, pets, you know, older women that have seemed to hold a kind of key to who you might want to be, and all of those relationships are drawn so beautifully. Was that an on-purpose thing?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for seeing all those different threads in the book. And yeah, older women that hold a key to who you want to be. I feel like that was something that really stood out to me in your book, which I had the pleasure of reading and we talked about last year. But yes, I did think of the project as really an investigation of love and the ways we love, what it means to love. And I don't think it's possible to talk about love without also talking about family and friendship and evidently dogs. And I was really interested in the way that all of those intimacies inform each other and overlap and, you know, yeah, form a big part of who we are and how we love.
Another thing that I really noticed was that perspective and distance play such a big part in the book. Your character, your narrator, who I've read the book twice, and the first time I read it, I did not realise that she didn't have a name. It wasn't until I went back and read it a second time that I went, wow, she's anonymous, and so is her mother. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I think it was, you know, one of those things that was largely intuitive at the beginning. But I really wanted it to feel like you were immersed in this woman's consciousness, in her memory, in her mind. And anytime I tried to name her, it sort of felt like very artificial and seemed to put the writing and the reader, I think, at a bit of a remove. And there's such an old, ongoing tradition of like anonymity in fiction. You know, I'm thinking way back, the very beginning of novels that would masquerade as series of letters or diaries. And I think there's a lot of pleasure for the reader in questioning that line between how much of this is fiction and how much of this is lived. And I really wanted to invite those possibilities and those questions.
Well, I think the fact that I didn't pick it up really indicates that it does very much place you inside the narrator's head. I had to wonder, when you were writing it, what did you call her? Did you? I can't imagine you thinking of her as the narrator while you wrote it.
I don't know if I thought of her. Yeah, I guess I didn't have that much distance from her when I was writing her, that I saw her as a character in the same way as the other characters in the book. The novel is not autobiographical, but I felt like she was so much an extension of myself, or a version of myself. If I had made different choices or my life had gone a different way, I always butcher this quote, but I once read the writer Milan Kundera say that all of his characters are like versions of himself that chose to walk down a different path or open a different doorway that he had circumnavigated. And so I guess I was thinking about the narrator as another possibility of myself in another possible life. So I wasn't calling her by my name, but I couldn't really think of a name for her that fit.
Yeah, I must say I was kind of imagining a girl very like you.
Yeah.
As I read it. And I also couldn't help imagining Sam Shepard as Jude. I know that you have a bit of a Sam Shepard
a bit of a thing. Yeah, I mean, who doesn't? Why not write? Why write it if we're not going to indulge some of those
That's
fantasies?
right. It was nice to imagine Sam Shepard in that role. He played him very well.
I know. I think a couple of my friends have asked, like, who would play Jude in a movie? Actually, one of my friends said, is there a part for Harrison Ford in this adaptation? And I said, maybe in the 70s. I think he might have aged out of the leading role now, tragically.
Yeah, don't tell Hollywood. They don't know that yet. And the character of King, like, that love affair is so pure. King is the dog in Thirst for Salt, and it's kind of hard to describe a love affair between a girl and a dog without it sounding not as important as other kinds of love, but it's a really, really special love story, and it's, I guess, because there's no expectations, and I feel like your character, your narrator, feels somewhat judged, or like she's trying to live up to people's expectations or her own expectations of what kind of life she should be having. And with King, she can just be herself.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about King?
Yeah, King is definitely my favourite character in the novel. And I think you put that so beautifully. I think that's one of the most profound things about our interactions with animals, is they don't have the same expectations that people have on us, and maybe as a result we can love them more purely or in a more uncomplicated way. I always say that, the dogs that I've loved in my life feel like the closest I've come to unconditional love. And it's not entirely untransactional. There are still certain things that you're expected to provide and you expect to get from them in return. But I think there's something about the way that animals express love is very pure and, different from the way that we do as people, where they don't second guess themselves to the same degree. Their feelings are kind of on the surface. And I always think that the dog in the book is, trying to teach them how to love each other better.
Yeah, I can see that. And the way he just turns up, the way she just turns up, which brings me to thinking about the way the house where Jude lives is almost an extension of him, and it's part of what makes him so attractive to her. All the things in his house, the beautiful items, the oldness and the steadiness of it, as she describes him. And I don't want to give any of the story away for anyone that hasn't read it, but at one part of the book he is unmoored from that house, and he almost comes across as an entirely different character. At that point he doesn't have the same kind of manliness and strength as he does in his own house. I feel like your narrator is constantly searching for a way to find a home like that of her own. Is there some kind of thread of searching for home through the book, do you think? Definitely.
I was really interested in the way that I think so much a part of growing up and coming of age is inhabiting a series of different homes. And the question of what it means to make a home, that being kind of a creative, often a collaborative act, and what it means to then leave that home and have to then do it all over again, what that takes from a person, what that requires. But I do in some ways think of, the narrator and her story is like cycling through a series of homes and families. There's the original family that you're born into, then the one that you build when you first move away from that family, which is in her case with roommates, as it often is. And then that first experience of adult intimacy where you're trying to build a domestic life with a partner, and then finding herself on her own and trying to understand what it means to have a family or or a home as one individual, and how that kind of family making and homemaking shifts throughout the course of our lives.
Well, it's also kind of explored through the mother character, who is constantly trying to fix places up and create a life for herself that she loves, and nothing is quite living up to her creative expectations. You know, she's such a beautiful, creative, colourful character, and it seems a little bit like the narrator is trailing behind her a little bit, trying to live a life as big as her mother has lived.
I would say that's true. Like, I think there's a line in the book where she describes her mother as being a pioneer at one point, and she's the one that's, trailing behind. And something I was interested as well, and this kind of brings back what you were saying earlier about those relationships with other women, as the narrator is someone who is constantly looking for other models of how to live. So looking for her mother, first of all, as the first model of how to live your life as a woman, and then searching for that in her friendships with other girls, and then with this older woman, a friend of Jude's. Looking for different models of how to live your life.
Yeah, she's wonderful, the character of May, Jude's friend, who is similar age to Jude. And at times she seems to make the narrator feel very out of her depth and childlike, and then at other times they have an incredible equality, and they're just woman to woman, dealing with the difficulties of life. The desire for a baby is a strong thread, the push and pull of wanting, not wanting, wondering if it's the thing to do or not. And I thought that was so evocative of what it is to be a young woman with all of these inputs from everywhere telling you what you should and shouldn't do.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, that wasn't a question.
No, but that's okay. It's a free-flowing conversation. No, exactly. And I think that so much of figuring out your life as a woman is often coming into conversation with those questions, whether or not you're really choosing to engage with them. They're questions that are going to be asked of you. And I guess my thinking about it is motherhood is, to me, I think, a deeply existential question. The question of fertility, like how much time do I have? What is the value of my time? I think these are really serious philosophical questions, but they're not often given that weight in literature. And so I really wanted to, engage with that quite deliberately, and honestly also felt a little taboo. I feel like sometimes the desire, or talking about the desire to have a baby is not so fashionable. And so part of me just wanted to take it as a literary subject and say, well, let's really look at this and think about it, because it is something that I found myself talking about with a lot of my female friends, even as early as the narrator was in her mid-20s. But there sort of seemed to be a silence around it, or even a sense of shame.
Well, in a lot of ways, some of the book is quite, not old-fashioned, but you're not trying to be an outrageous modern young woman. She enters into a kind of patriarchal almost relationship with an older man, which is not an unequal relationship. I'm sure you've been asked a lot about the dynamics of that. Perhaps that's something you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I think that one of the reasons why the age gap dynamic appealed to me is because I did see it as magnifying in some ways, I think, what can often feel like a power balance between men and women in a larger society. But also I think it really highlights a lot of the tensions that exist within any intimate relationship, where you're kind of, two people are coming together with their own histories, their own different levels of knowledge. There's often, shifts in power that have nothing to do with age, but I saw that as a way of kind of enlarging all of those issues that exist. And those tensions, I think, also exist not only between lovers, but also between parents and children, or between friends as well.
Yeah, it felt like when the relationship had little, bumps, that is the only time that it seemed like there was a kind of power imbalance, or that suddenly he sounded parental and the narrator felt childlike and didn't like that. In fact, maybe this is a good time for me to read that little
Sure,
paragraph
yeah.
I wanted to read. It's just very short and towards the end of the relationship. I dripped water on the floor, brought the sand in with me, bled on his sheets, ground down the gears on his truck, left my clothes on the couch, scratched the records by leaving them out of their sleeves, left water rings on the wood, broke his antique crystal glasses. It's like living with a teenager, he said. I was clumsy, careless. It's not my fault, I wanted to say. I hadn't learned how to contain myself, to be easy, gentle, to hold on to anything without breaking it. With the pressure you put on things, love, Jude said, they'll never last.
You read that so well, thank you.
Maybe this is a great time for you to do a little reading, maybe.
Sure, yeah, I mean, that sounded so good. I'm like, you should read the book now. But I guess in contrast to the part that Loine read, I will read a little bit from the beginning, where we kind of hear a little bit from the narrator where she is now in her life, in her late 30s, looking back on this relationship, kind of what starts her remembering this time again. Today I saw a picture of Jude with a child. Not one of the fair-haired nieces I remembered from photographs around the old house who would be grown by now, but a dark-haired little girl, 3 or 4 years old, still soft-cheeked, straight hair cropped at her chin, a short fringe that looked home-trimmed, eyes so brown they were almost black, a cupid's bow mouth stained with berries at the creases, Jude's lips. The photograph had been featured in an article about a portrait prize for capturing contemporary Australian life. The artist herself was unfamiliar to me, but it had come up when I searched Jude's name. Such a long time since I'd seen or heard from him, though sometimes, lonely and between lovers, I looked him up online. There was never much to find. Jude had remained a great resistor of technology, it seemed, in the time we'd been apart, preserving his privacy and his solitude. Within a few years of the fire, he had all but disappeared. But then this, Jude and his daughter overlooking a green valley at a farm or vineyard. Mountains behind them, bluing with distance, somewhere in Tasmania. Low grey fog lingering above the hills, like a memory of smoke. It was something in the way he held her. That's how I knew she was his. Not composed and smiling the way you would be when holding someone else's child to show that everyone is having a good time. They were caught off guard, Jude with his back to the camera and the girl in his arms. She was peering over his shoulder at whoever was taking the picture. He'd turned, just at the moment the shutter fell. His lips parted, as if about to speak. His face had aged, skin creased and papery at the corners of his eyes and the folds of his neck, which looked sunburned and tender, his hair cut shorter now. If I'm 37, Jude would be 55. Old, perhaps, to be a first-time father, and he did look tired, a dark patch beneath each eye like a stain, a new vulnerability to his expression. It was a beautiful photograph, and I was surprised how much that hurt. The greens lush and saturated like a country fresh with rain. Colour so rich I could almost taste the earth, the water in the air. The little girl's expression, solemn and soft. The art of it, the intimacy of that gaze. Briefly, it seemed like I had stumbled across an image from another life, that what I had seen was none other than the unrealized possibility of our long-ago love. Thank you.
Wow. So beautiful. One of the things I really noticed was your beautiful precision with words, and when you just said about how you could almost taste it. I felt throughout the book every description you had of the landscape, the food you were eating, the wind, the weather. your clothing, it was all so beautifully brought to life.
Thank you.
I loved the descriptions of fruit, especially. There seemed to be throughout it. It really exploded with kind of sweetness and colour and ripeness in a lovely kind of way of explaining the relationship, which was, I think, quite special and unusual. And the landscape, that's also such a strong, the setting is so strong. Was that a real place, Maddie?
Yeah, so Sailors Beach, it is a fictional town, but it's based on the Jervis Bay area of New South Wales, which was a place that I spent time and holidays when I was growing up with family and friends. And, you know, I was writing pretty much all of this book while I was living in New York. And I think it was that landscape that just really seemed to hold everything that I missed most about Australia. You know, the proximity to the ocean, the smell of eucalyptus after rain, the incredible raucous morning birds, which I don't think you hear, or I've never heard anywhere else in my life. And all of that had really vanished from my day-to-day existence. And yeah, I think it was the South Coast landscape specifically that seemed to hold all of those things.
Do you think that being so far away, living on the other side of the world, brought all of that into clearer focus?
Definitely. Yeah, I think it was actually a really generative thing, the distance. Sometimes I think when things are right in front of us, we almost can't see them clearly, or at least I definitely didn't appreciate them to the same degree that I did when I found myself longing for them and missing them.
Yeah, it's like it kind of haunts you and everything becomes a bit more beautiful, even the things that are a bit brutal.
No, definitely. And I don't think that the book would have had quite that same feeling of longing and yearning if I had been here myself.
I'm curious about how audiences outside of Australia are relating to it, being that it has such a strong Australian feel.
Yeah, I've been really surprised by the response from American readers so far, and it just came out in the UK about a week or two ago. And you know, some really lovely reviews have come in, and you never really know, you know, what's going to translate. And I think that's all writing, though. I think that with all writing, you're kind of trying to, I think it's a really hopeful act, the belief that you could transmit a feeling or a moment in your life in a way that someone else could understand and be moved by and feel it too. But I think it is more pronounced when there's that kind of cultural divide. But there was such a positive response in the US when it came out in March that I actually got a little bit nervous about it coming out in Australia. I was like, oh, yeah,
poppy.
Yeah, no,
Cut it down.
not that so much, but in terms of like, oh, if it resonated so well with Americans, like, have I got Australia right? You know, what if it doesn't resonate with Australians in the same way?
Yeah, right.
Luckily, it doesn't seem to have been an issue, but it did sort of make me nervous for a minute of, oh gosh, I've been living away for so long. Like, what if there were things that I have misremembered or gotten wrong?
Yeah, maybe the government tourist board will now employ you to spread the good word, because it sounds so beautiful. There's a bit where he gives you a couple. He gives the narrator a couple of books. I felt like every mention of a book was a little secret clue into the way that she thought that the narrator also works in a bookstore and she's a very bookish character. So she's reading Marguerite Duras', is that how you say it? Duras? I don't know. The Lover, which is, you know, a story of a relationship with a very young girl and an older man. And then Jude gives her Rebecca, which is the new wife. And then Wuthering Heights, where they fell in love at first sight. I felt like all of them were little clues to how we should be seeing the relationship. Are those kind of things that you thought about?
Yeah, I'm glad you picked them up. Definitely. I think that, first of all, those are just books that I really love and I'm drawn to, I guess, for my own reasons. you know, I've spoken a little bit elsewhere about when I started writing the book, I think I was very attracted to kind of doomed love stories. You know, Wuthering Heights was my favourite book when I was 17. And I think, it takes a certain kind of person to relate to that story, maybe.
There's also a Gatsby-esque kind of quality to your book, I feel like.
Another early influence.
Right.
But I did think about being really intentional with the references to other texts and other books as ways of framing the relationship. A lot of the books that are mentioned are also stories about coming of age as a young woman, not just The Lover, but Voyage in the Dark by Jean Rhys. The Bell Jar is also mentioned. And those were books not so much that influenced me while I was writing this, but were important to me as a young woman when I was the same age the narrator was. But then I also thought about, how can I use these texts to give little clues about how to frame that relationship or how to think about it or set it up as part of a long-going literary tradition.
Similarly, there's a scene where the narrator is going through Jude's record collection and she lists all of the records, and they're all, probably mid-70s or late 60s, 70s records, probably similar to what your narrator's mother would have had in her cool record collection, and records that your narrator would have taken on as her own records. And there's a wonderful little conversation between them, a confused conversation where he asks her if she knows who Bob Dylan is. And she says, of course. And it's just such a beautiful way of describing the confusion between their ages and how they're not quite sure how to relate to each other sometimes because of that gap, what to presume and what not to presume.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun writing the record list. I often say, I think one of the most generous things I did for Jude was give him my taste in music.
It's a very, very cool record collection.
And I guess I was thinking, what would I see on someone's shelf that might kind of imply a certain kind of character that I would be interested in, or what records, and you know this as a musician as well, I think those records are so personal, they say so much about us, and to find someone else who loves the exact same record that you do, it really says so much about a person, and you can feel a sort of instant kinship almost. It's like another shortcut to intimacy, I think.
Absolutely, but then it also, in the book, it suddenly reveals his past lover, which is presumably very confronting for the narrator because her past is so small.
Exactly.
She's just had exploratory kind of relationships, and he's had this long relationship that she doesn't get to know very much about, and I feel like it gives a bit of a chasm in the relationship.
Yeah, I think seemed like another way of illustrating that imbalance to me, because as you say, she's been with other people, but not in a significant way where you would kind of imprint on each other, or not enough to leave records behind or traces of you in the home. And I was kind of interested in the tension there because I think that it does throw her, but it also becomes part of his appeal. The fact that he could be a man that would be loved that way by a woman, and he has these interesting kind of creative, artistic girlfriends in his life, or women in his life, and she wants to be one of those women as well.
Yeah, so it's a way of finding herself almost through them as well as through him. Yeah. I wonder, were you tempted to use song lyrics and then discovered that it was really expensive, as I did?
Yes, it was tragic, actually. And I can't remember, one of my editors is here tonight, and I can't remember if Jane read the version that did have a lot of song lyrics in it. I did not realize how heartbreakingly expensive and difficult it is to quote song lyrics in a text, which is such a shame because, as you would relate to, music is my first love. I think in song lyrics a lot of the time. I think in those reference points, the way that you might also quote poetry, or there are other voices that exist in my head. And so there were a lot more lyrics originally, and as ways of adding kind of poetic texture. But I did discover the loophole is that you can quote album titles. So hence the long list of record collections was allowed to stay.
I had to wonder about that, and you did that so beautifully because of the way you had structured all of those titles was very rhythmic. It was almost like a kind of song, and in fact the whole book has a kind of song-like quality. It's like a long song, and the precision of the lyricalness of the sentences, it's like songwriting.
Thank you.
You should try and turn it into a song.
It would be epic.
Yeah. Tell me about the title. Where did that come from?
Yeah, so I'm always pleased to have the opportunity to say I did not come up with the title. The title is a reference to a Robert Hass poem called Meditations at Lagunitas, and it's one of the epigraphs of the book as well. And I read this poem towards the end of the writing process, and it's a poem that very much engages with longing and desire and memory and loss, and really spoke to a lot of the themes that I was already writing about. And it has this line in it, I think I'm probably going to butcher it now, but a violent wonder at her presence like a thirst for salt. I think I got it right. And it just was one of those uncanny moments because there was already so much salt riddled throughout the book as it was, not only because of the South Coast landscape and being so close to the sea, but salt being such a visceral, sensory thing, but also representing, in terms of the kind of old biblical story, the idea of a pillar of salt as this woman who has turned around to look at what she was leaving behind and then turned into salt. So it kind of had all these layers of resonance. And then when I found the poem, it was another thing that I kind of wanted to just quote and put in the novel. And right towards the end, we didn't have a title for it. And it was my agent, actually, who said, "What about Thirst for Salt?"
Wow.
And it had occurred to me before, but I think I mentioned it to a friend and she'd said, "Oh no, it reminds me of thirst traps." But when my agent said it, I was like, okay, I should have trusted my instinct. And then, that's how we came up with the title and ended up cutting that line from the book and just leaving it as the title instead.
Had you had working titles throughout?
Yes, but they didn't have really any poetry to them. They were kind of, they were more about like whatever was the dominant theme of what I was writing. And I think this came back from when I was thinking of the book as stories. So the story that won the Jolie Prize was called Ruins, and they all kind of had titles like that were an animal or a place or something, but nothing really encompassed the whole narrative.
Do you feel like you want to keep writing about... I feel like you wouldn't miss these people after writing about them for 10 years. They must feel so close to you now.
Yeah.
Could you write a sequel?
I don't know. I do really miss them, and it is. People have asked me what I'm working on now, and I just kind of said I'm not ready to form a new set of relationships yet. I'm not ready to move on. But I do feel like with these characters, I came to a sense of closure with their story. So I don't know that there's anything more left to explore. But I was saying the other night that I feel like I'll always write about similar themes and similar kinds of people. So in the way that I think about, my narrator as maybe being a different version of me, maybe there are other different versions of her that could possibly exist.
Yeah, kind of sliding doors.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm such a child of the 90s. Sliding doors is such a reference point for me.
I know the outline and the cover, but I still haven't watched it. I've actually got the DVD on my shelf. Have you thought about adapting it as a film or television? It's so kind of visceral and sensory. It feels like it would translate really well.
I would love to see it as a movie. I do have, a film, TV agent, so hopefully, fingers crossed that will eventuate into something. I don't think I'd want to adapt it myself. Would you let go? It's a good question. I think I'd want to be involved. I'd want to be in the room. But I feel like TV and film is not really my area of expertise. I'd want to hand it over to someone who actually knew what they were doing.
I'm sure you could work hand in hand with someone.
But there were a lot of films as well that kind of influenced the imaginary landscape of the novel, like particularly Jane Campion's The Piano, I was thinking about a lot as being such a kind of beautiful, visceral, sensory film. And I know it's set in New Zealand, but a lot of that bush landscape feels very familiar.
Yeah, it kind of changes from being really welcoming to being really difficult to manage and live within.
Yeah.
Gosh, I thought it was a great idea not to write any questions. I was super struck by all the descriptions of clothing throughout it. Also, I mean, I know that you're such a fabulous dresser, and it's obviously something that you're aware of, but there were so many great kind of contrasts, especially I loved the description of the mother character getting married in a wedding dress with black boots because she couldn't afford to buy wedding shoes, and Jude's kind of attention to detail in what he wore in contrast to all the locals in their much more casual clothes, and the narrator always snagging her silk dresses in this kind of rough house. Were you really imagining the items of clothing as you were writing? Like, were you playing kind of Barbies?
Oh my gosh, I feel like so much of my writing sensibility developed from playing Barbies as a kid. Honestly, it probably was an extension of that. Yeah, I don't think I realized that I cared so much about clothing until I actually wrote the book, and there are so many references to clothes. There's another scene where the narrator goes through her roommate's wardrobe and is looking at all her beautiful things and kind of comparing them as being different women, because the roommate buys these beautiful things, good quality, made to last, whereas the narrator is more drawn to things that are secondhand and have a life before her, and these kind of ornate silk dresses that aren't really appropriate for the bush landscape. And I think that is so much a part of navigating your early 20s, as well as like kind of literally trying on these different identities. But I think clothes are also just like textural, and I was so interested in all these different textures and like bits of sensory data that I could bring into the novel. So clothes, but also food and landscape, and then all sort of existing, I think, on the same very tactile plane for me.
The fact that you spent so long writing it, I think, has really added so much, or I imagine it's added so much to all those details. Like, I think I mentioned before that your original short story, it didn't really change very much from that original story to the book. So the fact that it took so long to write, I feel like you must have really honed in on details. Is that how it worked?
Yeah, I think, I've said before that I think that for me the revision process was actually much more generative and pleasurable than I had anticipated it to be, for that reason. Because once I had the characters and the structure and the main storyline down, then I could really just enjoy adding that level of detail. And it just sort of became a fun thing that I wanted to do, like how much more could I add to this scene, like what textures could I bring in. And the original stories before I wrote Ruins were actually quite sparse and minimal. And then I think when I felt like I had that bigger canvas of the novel, I could kind of play with that a lot more. And I wrote the Jolie story around the time that I was starting to make the switch of thinking, okay, maybe there is a bigger story here. And I think that was the moment where I really found the voice. And so it just worked really well that after I published that story, I thought, okay, this can be a chapter of the novel instead. And what if I could write a whole book that felt like the world of this story?
What was the kind of path to publication like, from having the idea of writing it as a book?
It was slow. Slow and very solitary. I mean, it's so different with fiction because most of the time you don't really talk to anyone about it or share it or sell it until you have the finished manuscript. So I really had to do a lot of work on those years on my own. And at that point I wasn't even with my agent. It wasn't until that I had that finished manuscript, which really only came together, I think, at the end of 2020. So it was a very long, slow process of me just spending time in this place.
It's the perfect process. I don't think you should change a thing. Would you think that your next book, do you think you'll write in a similar way, or you're not sure yet?
It's a good question. I have an idea for another book, but it came to me much more easily than this one, and so I instantly distrusted it. And I don't know, I think I'd like to think that I've learned a lot from like how to structure a novel, but I honestly think that I'm probably going to do it the same way I did last time. Already I have a short story that I've been working on that I keep finding myself wanting to go back and tinker with and add more, and I'm like, okay, maybe this is happening again.
This is how I do it.
I mean, maybe sort of, at least for me, maybe I have to trick myself into writing a novel. I don't think I've really honestly felt like it was something that I could do until I arrived at it through this slightly backwards route.
Does it now feel like something that you will do for the rest of your life?
Yeah. I think so as well. Like once you've kind of expanded a story or had that larger canvas, it's harder to think about really only spending time with the characters or settings in this one tiny, small, contained story.
Yeah.
And I also like came to really love novels and I think all writers have fraught relationships with writing, but I loved reading novels and being able to spend that extended time in a world.
Well, I think that brings us to the point where we'll open it up for questions. I can't remember, do I hand the microphone around? Okay, I'll just repeat. So does anybody have a question that they would like to ask Maddie? And if you do, perhaps just stand up or raise your hand. Yeah.
Can you please set aside the first copy of your next novel for me?
Thank you. Thank you so much for saying that. That's so nice.
Very true. So that was just a compliment, but a very well-deserved compliment. Yes, Bronwyn.
Can I ask about the writing process or the editing process in particular? Because your narrator at one point is talking about her writing and how she has all the papers spread out and she's cutting and pasting basically and snipping. And it actually reminded me of our early days in the kids shop at Bray's, and you and the other younger staff members at the time in the wonderful window displays you used to create by cutting and pasting and lots of collage. And is that actually how you write as well?
So, do I repeat? Yes, so the question was, what is Maddie's editing process and writing process like, and does it involve cutting and pasting?
It used to, yes. That was kind of a more ornate, romanticized description of what my writing process looked like. I think because I was used to working in a much shorter form, and I think structure is something that I've always struggled with as a writer, maybe because I write so much about memory, and there isn't always... Memory has its own logic, it's associative, so there isn't always a clear order that things should naturally go in. And so when I was learning to figure this out, I would cut up paragraphs, sometimes sentences, and move them around on the floor. And it was something that was really important when I started the draft of Thirst for Salt, because I had these much larger pieces of these stories that I'd written, and I really believe in recycling any text that's good. So I would take the parts that I wanted to keep and then try and figure out how they would go in this new order. I think to give myself some credit, I've gotten a little better, and I don't do that so much anymore, but I also now have a dog. And so the cutting and pasting and laying things out on the floor is not really going to work so well in a house where there's a dog running around. So I think I've had to sort of adapt a little bit. But I'm glad you asked about that scene. In earlier drafts, I didn't have that much about the narrator writing or being a writer. And I think it was because, when I was in kind of workshop settings, people had said, oh, it's boring to read about characters who are writers. And so I had taken it out. But then I realized that so much of the narrator's coming of age as a young woman was tied to her coming of age as an artist. And I thought, actually, especially for women, I don't know that there really are that many descriptions of women writing or women doing creative work. Like, that felt important to show and to illustrate. And I also really loved that scene in Greta Gerwig's Little Women, where her character of Jo is shown to be writing, and how seen I felt by that. And so I thought, okay, maybe I'll put this back in my book for the same reasons.
That's fantastic.